Hi there, I'm Tuana Pastin from the Department of Economics, Maynooth University. I know some of you wonder what to study in the university. And in this video, I would like to give you a bit of flavor of how economists think and how what you'll study in the university relates to the real world. For this video, I picked the topic of minimum wages because minimum wages create a lot of political and economic debate and sometimes very heated arguments, and we will find out why. Here is an announcement by the Irish government. It is regarding the raise in the minimum wage rate. And what does this mean? Is this a good news or a bad news? For instance, will it improve your chances of finding a summer job? What about your friend's mom who works at the fast food joint? Is she going to be happy about this news? An increase in the wage rate sounds like a good news, is it? What about the whole Irish economy? Is this a good policy decision for the Irish economy? How will it affect the inflation? And what about the rate of unemployment? And what about economic growth? So all these questions we're going to be able to analyze by initially looking at the effects of the minimum wage regulation on the labor market. In this video, I will interview academics and policy influencers about these questions. We will see what the experts in Ireland have to say about minimum wage. Let us start with the question of what is a minimum wage? Minimum wage is a piece of legislation that says that no employer is allowed to pay less than the minimum wage. In this case, €10.20. So if there is a guy out there who is willing to work for €9 per hour and the employer wants to hire that worker for €9 per hour, the government says, no guys, no, you have to pay at least €10.20. First, let us think about the effect of a minimum wage on the labor market before talking about the effect of it on the general economy. Economists love using graphs to tell stories. And here we're going to tell the story of the labor market, the story of minimum wage using graphs. On the vertical axis, I have the wage rate. And on the horizontal axis, I have the quantity of labor. And this here line, I'm going to let it represent the supply of labor. This line summarizes a lot of information for me. So you tell me the wage rate, the ongoing wage rate in the economy, and I will tell you how many people would be willing to work at that wage rate. And at a higher wage rate, you would have more people who would be willing to work. So for instance, Susan would be considering taking the kids to the grandma for childminding and would consider working at that higher wage rate. And if the wage rate were even higher, even granddad would consider joining the labor force. And instead of watching TV, he would like to work at that high wage rate. How about firms? Well, firms, they demand labor. They need workers. Here we will assume a perfectly competitive labor market. So each firm is too small to affect the ongoing wage rate. So individual firms will decide on how many workers to hire at the ongoing wage rate. Here is the demand for labor. If the wages are high, firms would like to hire only a few people, but if the wages were low, firms would like to hire more people. So think of a fast food joint, for instance. If the wages are very high, they might get only one cleaner. But if the wages are low enough, they would like to get two cleaners to be able to provide better service to the customers who will then come more often and who will increase the revenue of the restaurant. And we're going to bring the demand and supply together in order to see what wage rate actually prevails. Just looking at the supply, I don't know what the wage rate is going to be. All it tells me is at what wage rate, how many people would be willing to work. Only looking at the demand doesn't tell me about the wage rate in the economy either. It will only tell me how many people firms would like to hire at that wage rate. But what will be the wage rate? For that, I need to bring demand and supply together. And here is the magical point where we have the equilibrium wage rate. At this equilibrium wage rate, the quantity demanded of labor, the number of workers that the firms want to hire, and the quantity supplied of labor, the number of people who want to work, are exactly equal to each other. So this here gives us the equilibrium level of employment. In this economy, given this demand and supply, there will be this many people who are employed. So what makes this equilibrium wage rate so special? Why does it get a star? Why is it W star? So let's think about a lower wage than the equilibrium wage rate. At this low wage rate, firms would like to hire this many people. But only this many people want to work. That means there is excess demand for labor. It means firms have openings, they have positions, they are advertising these positions, but they are not getting applicants to apply for the job because people find the wage rate to be low. So if the firm wants to hire, what the firm can do is offer a higher wage rate that drives up the wages, and this drive continues until we hit the equilibrium wage rate. So what this means is actually, for instance, the equilibrium wage rate is 10 euro per hour. And let's say the government imposes a minimum wage of 9 euro. In that case, that minimum wage that the government imposed is non-binding, even though there is a law that says you cannot pay less than 9 euro to any of your workers, and no one was going to pay that anyway. The equilibrium wage rate is 10 euro. So a non-binding wage is completely wasted. It has no effect on the economy. The wages turn out to be the equilibrium wage rate, and it's just a legislation that can be thrown to trash. Let's talk about the equilibrium wage rate some more. Let's say it's 10 euro per hour. So this would have been the wage rate in the equilibrium in the economy if there was no government intervention. At this wage rate, the good news is there is no unemployment, right? The number of people who want to work at that wage rate is exactly the same as the number of people firms want to hire. But there is possibly a bad news. So think about a guy, only wage earner for the house. So this guy making 10 euro per hour, if he works full time for weeks, that makes about 1,600 euro. Well, is this a living wage? Can this full-time working man feed the family? Can he clothe the family? Can he give shelter to the family? Well, probably not under current conditions in Ireland. So here is the first political debate question for you then. This man is living under poverty even though he works full-time. He's working for a big grocery store who every year reports big profit. The union would say, why so much profit to the big companies and no living wages for a family guy? So the unions would say, you have to intervene. As a government, you have to intervene to be able to correct this injustice. So let us now think about the minimum wage that is above the equilibrium wage rate. In this case, this many people would like to work. As you can see, more people want to work than before because it's a higher wage rate. But the firms want to hire only this many people. This is a lower number than we had before when the wages were lower. So there is a difference between the quantity of labor supplied, how many people want to work at the minimum wage, and the quantity of labor demanded, the number of people that the firms want to hire. So that creates unemployment in the economy. Now, this many people want to work but are unable to find a job at the minimum wage. And even if they said, oh, come on, I'm willing to accept a lower wage rate than the minimum wage, the government comes in and says, nope, you can't do that. No firm is allowed to hire at a lower wage rate than the current minimum wage rate. What else happens? Now, the employment goes down because the wages are higher. Firms would like to hire less people. Now, what this means is the imposition of a minimum wage regulation, market clearing wage rate, a binding minimum wage, is going to lead the firms to fire some of their workers. Some workers are fired. The ones that keep their job are now getting paid higher than before. So you can already see why this is a big political debate, because there are winners and losers. The firm certainly doesn't like a higher wage rate. They would like to pay as low as possible. The workers who keep their jobs are happier because their wage rate went up. The workers who lose their job because of the minimum wage are unhappy. And actually, there is also all these people who are unemployed, who are searching for a job and who are unable to find a job. They're going to be unhappy too. Another lobby group might be the consumers, because an increase in the wage rate is an increase in the cost of production for the firm. The firm is going to reflect the increase in the cost of production to the final good prices, and that can increase the prices in general. So if we're talking about the fast food joint, now the fast food joint has to pay a higher wage rate for their cleaners, which is going to increase the price of the hamburgers eventually. Another thing that comes out of this graph is because less labor is employed, that means less production. So if we're thinking about a factory, and now the factory has less workers at the assembly line, when the number of workers goes down, the quantity of the output produced goes down, which means that the overall output for the economy goes down. But how drastic are these negative effects? Are they very minor, are they insignificant, or are they very large? The answer to this question depends on a multitude of factors, but one of them is the elasticity of demand for labor, the wage elasticity of demand for labor. That is, when the wage goes up, by how much does the firm respond? Does the firm respond a lot by firing people, or does the firm not respond a lot? So I'll make this point with the graph. Start out with our usual graph. Now put down another graph that has the same equilibrium wage rate, same level of employment in equilibrium. Demand for labor is less elastic in the second picture. Let's impose the same minimum wage in both economies. In the first one, the level of employment goes down by quite a lot, whereas in the second one, the level of employment goes down by a little bit when we impose the same minimum wage. Because in the second one, the demand for labor is not very responsive to changes in the wage levels. And here is a supply of labor that is not as elastic at W star as in the previous picture. You can see that in an economy where the demand for labor and the supply of labor are not very wage elastic, the effect of the minimum wage, the adverse effects of minimum wage are going to be less significant. This is the basic labor demand, labor supply analysis of minimum wages. This is what you would have in introductory textbooks to economics. But this is not the end of the story. Actually, it is the beginning of the story. 75 prominent economists came out for the case of US, and 7 of them were Nobel Prize winning economists, and they said, wait a second, we defend minimum wages, and it made a huge news splash. They said decent minimum wage is not only a matter of basic fairness for hardworking families, it is also good for economic policy that will spur consumer demand and create jobs. And you're going to say, wait, what's happening? All this time in my analysis, I told you that minimum wage is going to reduce employment depending on the elasticity of demand for labor, either by a big amount or by a small amount. But now, these Nobel Prize winners and experts in the field are saying, wait, minimum wage is actually going to create jobs. Where are they coming from? Now, let's look at these people who are earning higher wages. What do they do with the higher wages? These are low wage earners. They really need that money. So they go ahead and spend, they consume. When they consume on goods, they consume on services, and these goods and services need to be produced in the economy. So the firms see an increased aggregate demand, and they will start producing more. To be able to produce more, they will have to hire more people. So the demand at the ongoing minimum wage is then going to shift to reflect that increase in the demand for labor to be able to produce more because of the increase in the aggregate demand.
Theoretically, it's even possible that the increase in aggregate demand overturns the initial effect, dampening effect of the minimum wages on employment and increase the level of employment. So this is what introductory textbooks cover on the perfectly competitive labor market and minimum wages. Now it's time to go and talk to academics and policy influencers about minimum wages in Ireland. And my first guest is Dr. Paul Redman. Paul got his PhD from the Department of Economics at Maynooth University, and I'm proud to say that I was his supervisor, and since then he has been a very prolific researcher and he developed expertise on minimum wages. My first question to Paul was to tell us about his current position at ESRI.
I'm a researcher in the Economic and Social Research Institute in Dublin, and we do policy relevant research. So we do research for a lot of, for example, government departments, and we research program evaluation in the labour market, among other things.
One of your research pieces recently is on minimum wages in Ireland and the pandemic. Can you talk about some of your findings?
There's about 8% of employees in Ireland are on the minimum wage. They're slightly more likely to be women. They tend to be young, part-time workers. They're typically not the main earner in a household. That's quite rare. It's likely that they're what we'd call a secondary earner. So you may have the main earner who's on high wages, but perhaps one spouse then has a minimum wage job working fewer hours on a lower wage. So with the onset of the pandemic, a lot of the firms that minimum wage workers would have worked in, they were actually forced to close, which meant that a lot of minimum wage and low paid workers in general found themselves without jobs.
Paul, one of your strengths as a researcher is that you do both theoretical and empirical work. Could you tell us about theory versus empirical research and how they connect?
So by a theoretical model, we mean we try and establish a framework that allows us to understand what may or may not happen when a minimum wage goes up. Then the challenge is you take the predictions of your model and you look at the actual data and you test those predictions to see if they're true or if they're not true. And if they're not true, then you may have to revisit your model and see how you may need to change this to try and make it more realistic. And what we do is, and what a lot of the recent research does is, it takes the perfectly competitive labour market as a starting point, but then it says, well, is it realistic what we're saying about the perfectly competitive labour market? And when you think about it, one of the things that really may not be realistic is in a perfectly competitive labour market, if a firm was to, let's say, reduce their wages, then all the employees would leave. That's clearly not realistic. So that's led to other theoretical models being developed that are more realistic and more consistent with that. Because what we have is that in reality, firms can lower their wages and they can still retain some workers. And what we call this is called monopsony power. It's the power of firms to exert some control over the wages they set. So the key point is that these other models that perhaps are more realistic of the labour market, they generate predictions that are very different from the perfectly competitive model. And one of those predictions is that you can increase a minimum wage in this type of monopsony setting without generating unemployment. Again, the task is that we look at the predictions from the monopsony model, but we need to test them empirically. And what we mean is to test something empirically, you look at these predictions, you go and look at actual data, and you see when you look at the data, does this match what the model says? A lot of the recent minimum wage literature would indicate that when you increase the minimum wage by small or moderate amounts, it doesn't actually generate unemployment. That being said, there are studies that find that it does have some negative employment effects, but if you review the literature in general, it shows little to no employment effects.
Paul, thank you very much for coming. It was a pleasure to talk with you as usual.
Thanks, Stefana.
For our second interview, we're going to leave the off-campus home office studio and go to Maynooth University to visit Professor Donald ONeill in his office. Donald is an expert in minimum wages. He is a labor economist and he has multiple international peer-reviewed academic articles on labor economics. And my first question to Donald was to tell us a little bit about his research.
Sure, Tawana. So the national minimum wage was introduced in Ireland in April 2000. So it's 20 years old today. And before it was introduced, I did some work for the government advising them on the likely effects of various rates that would be introduced. And then subsequent to that, when the legislation was brought in, I published a number of papers evaluating the actual consequences. Subsequent to that, I've worked on papers looking at why economists have different opinions on minimum wages and trying to reconcile those. And I've looked at the impact of minimum wages on inequality. And my most recent research is looking at minimum wages in India, in a low-income country where issues like compliance tends to be quite important.
Could you tell us a little bit about what economists think about the perfectly competitive market model that I have just presented in the video to the students?
Sure. So the general consensus among economists maybe 20-25 years ago was that minimum wages would lead to job losses as predicted by the perfectly competitive model. And the logic is quite compelling because in this model, workers get paid what they're worth to the firm. So if a firm is forced to raise its wage, then any profit maximizing firm is going to be left with no choice but to let go of some workers who are no longer profitable. However, economists are beginning to think that the labour market doesn't work quite as smoothly as predicted by the perfectly competitive model. So there are mobility costs, there are search costs, there's incomplete information. These are things that are not captured in the perfectly competitive model. And these small adjustments to the model can change the predictions quite drastically. So for instance, if there's incomplete information, if workers don't know what wages are available at other firms, then this gives its firm wage setting power, which it uses to keep wages low and employment low. And what this does is it creates a wedge between what the worker is actually bringing to the firm and what they're being paid. And in this instance, an increase in the minimum wage doesn't necessarily make those workers unprofitable, and firms may be inclined to hire more workers as a result of the increase in labour supply that comes about. So I think it's fair to say that at this stage, from a theoretical point of view, the impact of a minimum wage is an open question. and really needs to be addressed by careful empirical analysis.
You were also influential on Irish policy while you were working on the Low Pay Commission. Could you tell us about the Low Pay Commission?
Sure. So the Low Pay Commission was a commission that was developed or introduced in 2015, essentially to depoliticize the setting of the minimum wage. So prior to this, the minimum wage was set by the government with relatively little input from academics or other interests. So what the Low Pay Commission did was it set up a group of 9 members, 3 representatives from employers, 3 representatives from the workers' side, 2 economists and a chair. And the role of the commission was to provide an evidence base for the recommendations in terms of the minimum wage. The role of the labour economist on the commission was first to update and advise the other members on the latest research surrounding the minimum wage, and then secondly to listen to and engage with the other members in an attempt to come up with an evidence-based consensus on what an appropriate rate for the minimum wage would be, and then to forward that recommendation to government.
You were on the Low Pay Commission for 4 years. Tell us about what got achieved over the 4 years.
I would argue that the Commission achieved quite a lot. So I was involved in making 4 annual recommendations, and over that time period, the minimum wage was increased by €1.15. So slightly over 13%, but in terms of numbers, this affected between 150,000 to 200,000 of the lowest paid, most vulnerable workers. So I think we made a big difference to the working conditions of low paid workers. And I also think we made a difference to the environment in which people can evaluate the minimum wage. Because when we started doing this, there was a significant gap in the data that existed around. So when we wrote our first report, we didn't know how many people were affected by the minimum wage. We could tell you 3 years previously, but we didn't know. So what we did over this time period was work closely with the Central Statistics Office to gather more timely data on minimum wages. And we now have quarterly data year on year, which can be used to feed into the evidence base and also into subsequent evaluations. So I think both from affecting the lives of workers and making the lives of academics better, I think we've made a contribution.
And you should be very proud of
Thank
the
you,
achievements.
Joanna.
Thank you very much for the interview.
This concludes our discussion about minimum wages in this video. If you're wondering whether to study economics and what else is economics other than minimum wages, I'm going to recommend you 2 books. And these are very much fun books. One is Freakonomics. It's written by an economist and a journalist. It's a very much fun read. You can see how an economist thinks, and it covers topics such as sumo wrestlers and the value of the parenting, good parenting in educational outcomes of children, and whether legalization of abortion in US has had any effects on the crime rate. The second book I recommend is Game Theory, a graphical guide. And this book covers all environments where there is strategic interaction, from international environmental policy to advertising wars, to stock market crashes, to the economic perspective on religion and the difficult rituals some religions impose to their members. So economics is not so much about a subject matter, but rather about how to think. So there are economists who will study marketing. There are economists who study product development. Some economists study human resource management, how to motivate the workers. We study also macroeconomic policies, what sort of monetary policy a government should have, what sort of trade policies the government should have, but also simply how do individuals behave, how do the firm behaves, and all sorts of other social issues that relate to the human nature and how we make decisions. Whatever it is that you pick to study, pick the thing that you enjoy. If you enjoy it, you'll be successful in it. Good luck to you all.